17. Absolute advertising. Ground zero advertising. Today what we are experiencing is the absorption of all virtual modes of expression into that of advertising. All original cultural forms, all determined languages are absorbed in advertising because it has no depth, it is instantaneous and instantaneously forgotten. Triumph of superficial form, of the smallest common denominator of all signification, degree zero of meaning, triumph of entropy over all possible tropes. The lowest form of energy of the sun. This unarticulated, instantaneous form, without a past, without a future, without the possibility of metamorphosis, has power over all the others. All current forms of activity tend toward advertising and most exhaust themselves therein. Not necessarily advertising itself, the kind that is produced as such, but the form of advertising, that of a simplified operational mode, vaguely seductive, vaguely consensual, all the modalities are confused therein, but in an attenuated, agitated mode. More generally, the form of advertising is one in which all particular contents are annulled at the very moment when they can be transcribed into each other, whereas what is inherent to weighty enunciations, to articulated forms of meaning, or of style, is that they cannot be translated into each other, any more than the rules of a game can be. This long movement toward translatability and thus toward a complete combinatorial, which is that of the superficial transparency of everything, of their absolute advertising, of which professional advertising is, once again, only an episodic form, can be read in the vicissitudes of propaganda. The whole scope of advertising and propaganda comes from the October Revolution and the market crash of 1929. Both languages of the masses, issuing from the mass production of ideas, or commodities, their registers, separate at first, progressively converge. Propaganda becomes the marketing and merchandising of idea forces, of political men and parties with their trademark image. Propaganda approaches advertising as it would the vehicular model of the only great and veritable idea force of this competing society, the commodity, and the mark. This convergence defines a society in which there is no longer any difference between the economic and the political, because the same language reigns in both, from one end to the other, a society therefore where the political economy, literally speaking, is finally fully realized. That is to say dissolved as a specific power, as an historical mode of social contradiction, resolute, absorbed in a language without contradictions, like a dream, because traversed by purely superficial intensities. A subsequent stage is crossed once the very language of the social, after that of the political, becomes confused with this fascinating solicitation of an agitated language, once the social turns itself into advertising, turns itself over to the popular vote by trying to impose its trademark image. From the historical destiny that it was, the social itself fell to the level of a collective enterprise securing its publicity on every level. See what surplus value of the social each advertisement tries to produce. Werben, advertise, the solicitation of the social everywhere, present on walls, in the hot and bloodless voices of female radio announcers, in the accents of the soundtrack and in the multiple tonalities of the image track that is played everywhere before our eyes. A social ID everywhere present, an absolute social ID finally realized in absolute advertising, that is to say, also totally dissolved, a vestige of social ID hallucinated on all the walls in the simplified form of a demand of the social that is immediately met by the echo of advertising. The social as a script, whose bewildered audience we are. Thus the form of advertising has imposed itself and developed at the expense of all the other languages as an increasingly neutral, equivalent rhetoric, without affects, as a nascent tactic nebula, Eve Sturge would say, which envelopes us from every side, and which at the same time eliminates the hotly controversial problem of belief and efficacy. It does not offer signifieds in which to invest, it offers a simplified equivalence of all the formerly distinctive signs, and deters them with this very equivalence. This defines the limits of advertising's current power and the conditions of its disappearance, since today advertising is no longer a stake, it has both entered into our customs and at the same time escaped the social and moral dramaturgy that it still represented 20 years ago. It is not that people no longer believe in it or that they have accepted it as routine. It is that if its fascination once lay in its power to simplify all languages, today this power is stolen from it by another type of language that is even more simplified and thus more functional, the languages of computer science. The sequence model, the soundtrack, and the image track that advertising, along with the other big media, offers us, the model of the cominatory, equal distribution of all discourses that it proposes, this still rhetorical continuum of sounds, signs, signals, slogans that it erects as a total environment is largely overtaken, precisely in its function of simulation, by the magnetic tape, by the electronic continuum that is in the process of being silhouetted against the horizon of the end of the century. Microprocessing, digitality, cybernetic languages go much further in the direction of the absolute simplification of processes than advertising did on its humble, still imaginary and spectacular level. And it is because these systems go further that today they polarize the fascination that formerly devolved on advertising. It is information, in the sense of data processing, that will put an end to, that is already putting an end to the reign of advertising. That is what inspires fear, and what is thrilling. The thrill of advertising has been displaced onto computers and onto the miniaturization of everyday life by computer science. The anticipatory illustration of this transformation was Philip K. Dick's papula, that transistorized advertising implant, a sort of broadcasting leech, an electronic parasite that attaches itself to the body and that is very hard to get rid of. But the papula is still an intermediary form, it is already a kind of incorporated prosthesis, but it still incessantly repeats advertising messages. A hybrid, then, but a prefiguration of the psychotropic and data processing networks of the automatic piloting of individuals, next to which the conditioning by advertising looks like a delightful change in fortune. Currently, the most interesting aspect of advertising is its disappearance, its dilution as a specific form, or even as a medium. Advertising is no longer, was it ever, a means of communication or of information. Or else it is overtaken by the madness specific to overdeveloped systems, that of voting for itself at each moment, and thus of parodying itself. If at a given moment, the commodity was its own publicity, there was no other, today publicity has become its own commodity. It is confused with itself, and the eroticism with which it ridiculously cloaks itself is nothing but the autoerotic index of a system that does nothing but designate itself, whence the absurdity of seeing in it an alienation of the female body. As a medium become its own message, which makes it so that now there is a demand for advertising in and of itself, and that thus the question of believing in it or not is no longer even posed. Advertising is completely in unison with the social, whose historical necessity has found itself absorbed by the pure and simple demand for the social, a demand that the social function like a business, a group of services, a mode of living or of survival, the social must be saved just as nature must be preserved, the social is our niche, whereas formerly it was a sort of revolution in its very project. This is certainly lost, the social has lost precisely this power of illusion, it has fallen into the register of supply and demand, just as work has passed from being a force antagonistic to capital to the simple status of employment, that is to say of goods, eventually rare, and services just like the others. One can thus create advertising for work, the joy of finding work, just as one will be able to create advertising for the social. And, today, true advertising lies therein, in the design of the social, in the exaltation of the social in all its forms, in the fierce, obstinate reminder of the social, the need for which makes itself rudely felt. Folkloric dances in the metro, innumerable campaigns for security, the slogan "Tomorrow I work" accompanied by a smile formerly reserved for leisure time, and the advertising sequence for the election to the Prudhoms, an industrial tribunal "I don't let anyone choose for me," and Ubusk slogan, one that rang so spectacularly falsely, with the mocking liberty, that approving the social while denying it. It is not by chance that advertising, after having, for a long time, carried an implicit ultimatum of an economic kind, fundamentally saying and repeating incessantly, I buy, I consume, I take pleasure, today repeats in other forms, I vote, I participate, I am present, I am concerned, mirror of a paradoxical mockery, mirror of the indifference of all public signification. The opposite panic, one knows that the social can be dissolved in a panic reaction, an uncontrollable chain reaction. But it can also be dissolved in the opposite reaction, a chain reaction of inertia, each micro-universe saturated, auto-regulated, computerized, isolated in automatic pilot. Advertising is the prefiguration of this, the first manifestation of an uninterrupted thread of signs, like ticker tape, each isolated in its inertia. Disaffected, but saturated. Desensitized, but ready to crack. It is in such a universe that what Baudrillard calls the aesthetic of disappearance gathers strength, that the following being to appear, fractal objects, fractal forms, fault zones that follow saturation, and thus a process of massive rejection, of the aberration or stupor of a society purely transparent to itself. Like the signs in advertising, one is geared down, one becomes transparent or uncountable, one becomes diaphanous or rhythmic to escape the point of inertia, one is placed in orbit, one is plugged in, one is satellized, one is archived, paths cross, there is the sound track, the image track, just as in life there is the work track, the leisure track, the transport track, etc., all enveloped in the advertising track. Everywhere there are 3 or 4 paths, and you are at the crossroads. Superficial saturation and fascination. Because fascination remains. One need only look at Las Vegas, the absolute advertising city, of the 1950s, of the crazy years of advertising, which has retained the charm of that era, today retro in some sense, because advertising is secretly condemned by the programmatic logic that will give rise to very different cities. When one sees Las Vegas rise whole from the desert in the radiance of advertising at dusk, and return to the desert when dawn breaks, one sees that advertising is not what brightens or decorates the walls, it is what effaces the walls, effaces the streets, the facades, and all the architecture, effaces any support and any depth, and that it is this liquidation, this reabsorption of everything into the surface, whatever signs circulate there, that plunges us into the stupefied, hyper-real euphoria that we would not exchange for anything else, and that is the empty and inescapable form of seduction. Language allows itself to be dragged along by its double, and joins the best to the worst for a phantom of rationality whose formula is everyone must believe in it. Such is the message of what unites us. J. L. Bouts, Le Destructeur d'Intensités, the destroyer of intensities, advertising, therefore, like information, destroyer of intensities, accelerator of inertia. See how all the artifices of meaning and of non-meaning are repeated in it with lassitude, like all the procedures, all the mechanisms of the language of communication, the function of contact, you understand me? Are you looking at me? It will speak. The referential function, the poetic function even, the illusion, the irony, the game of words, the unconscious, how all of that is staged exactly like sex in pornography, that is to say without any faith, with the same tired obscenity. That is why, now, it is useless to analyze advertising as language, because something else is happening there, a doubling of language, and also of images, to which neither linguistics nor semiology correspond, because they function on the veritable operation of meaning, without the slightest suspicion of this caricatural exorbitance of all the functions of language, this opening onto an immense field of the mockery of signs, consumed as one says in their mockery, for their mockery and the collective spectacle of their game without stakes, just as porno is a hypertrophied fiction of sex consumed in its mockery, for its mockery, a collective spectacle of the inanity of sex in its baroque assumption, it was the baroque that invented this triumphal mockery of stucco, fixing the disappearance of the religious in the orgasm of statues. Where is the golden age of the advertising project? The exaltation of an object by an image, the exaltation of buying and of consumption through the sumptuary spending of advertising? Whatever the subjugation of publicity to the management of capital, but this aspect of the question, that of the social and economic impact of publicity, always remains unresolved and fundamentally insoluble. It always had more than a subjugated function. It was a mirror held out to the universe of political economy and of the commodity. It was for a moment their glorious imaginary, that of a torn-up world, but an expanding one. But the universe of the commodity is no longer this one. It is a world both saturated and in involution. In one blow, it lost both its triumphal imaginary, and, from the mirror stage, it passed in some sense to the stage of mourning. There is no longer a staging of the commodity, there is only its obscene and empty form. And advertising is the illustration of this saturated and empty form. That is why advertising no longer has a territory. Its recoverable forms no longer have any meaning. The Forum des Halles, for example, is a gigantic advertising unit, an operation of publicitude. It is not the advertising of a particular person, of any firm. The Forum also does not have the status of a veritable mall or architectural whole, any more than Baudrillard is, in the end, a cultural center. These strange objects, these super gadgets simply demonstrate that our social monumentality has become advertising. And it is something like the Forum that best illustrates what advertising has become, what the public domain has become. The commodity is buried, like information is in archives, like archives are in bunkers, like missiles are in atomic silos. Gone the happy and displayed commodity, now that it flees the sun, and suddenly it is like a man who has lost his shadow. Thus the Forum des Halles closely resembles a funeral home, the funereal luxury of a commodity buried, transparent, in a black sun. Sarcophagus of the commodity. Everything there is sepulchral, white, black, salmon marble. A bunker case in deep, snobbish, dull black mineral underground space. Total absence of fluids. There is no longer even a liquid gadget like the veil of water at Parley 2*1 which at least fooled the eye. Here not even an amusing subterfuge, only pretentious mourning is staged. The only amusing idea in the whole thing is precisely the human and his shadow who walk in trompe l'oeil on the vertical dais of concrete, a gigantic, beautiful grey, open-air canvas, serving as a frame to the trompe l'oeil. This wall lives without having wished to, in contrast to the family vault of haute couture and prêt-à-porter that constitutes the Forum. This shadow is beautiful because it is an illusion in contrast to the inferior world that has lost its shadow. All that one could hope for, once the sacred space was open to the public, and for fear that illusion, as in the Lascaux caves, cause it to deteriorate irremediably, think of the waves of people from the rare, *2 was that it be immediately closed off to circulation and covered with a definitive shroud in order to keep this testimony to a civilization that has arrived, after having passed the stage of the apogee, at the stage of the hypogee, of the commodity, intact. There is a fresco here that traces the long route traversed, starting with the man of Todtable passing through Marx and Einstein to arrive at Dora Leibniz. Why not save this fresco from decomposition? Later the speleologists will rediscover it, at the same time that they discover a culture that chose to bury itself in order to definitively escape its own shadow, to bury its seductions and its artifices as if it were already consecrating them to another world. Notes 1. Parley 2 is a mall that was built in the 1970s on the outskirts of Paris Trans. 2. The Rare is a high-speed, underground commuter train trans.